Hi, this is John Hanson, and this is another flipped classroom video designed to give more time in the classroom for student questions and discussion. This session picks up very briefly with Plouffe v. Putnam and the role that eugenics played in explaining and justifying inequalities around Lake Champlain in northern Vermont at that time. It then connects eugenics as a scientific theory to the then growing and increasingly salient inequalities in many parts of the U.S. And finally, it considers the role that prominent scientists at prominent universities, particularly Harvard, played in promoting the science of eugenics. Okay, so to begin, let me remind you briefly of some of the stereotypes and prejudices that informed the interactions between the haves, including the tourists and gentrifying landowners, as illustrated by Henry Putnam, and the relative have-nots, including the economically and socially displaced French Canadians, as typified by the Plouffe family. Among the locals, recall, the Plouffes and their ilk were considered lake pirates who made their living preying upon the property of property owners around the lake. The public anxieties brought the Plouffes to the attention of eugenicists like Henry Perkins, who organized and conducted the eugenics survey of so-called degenerate families in Vermont. As one historian recounts, Perkins's eugenics lesson on the pirates portrayed them as a threat to public health and safety. They lived in utmost squalor and destitution. Disease and feeble-mindedness are always conspicuous in the children. They were the terror of property owners and boat owners because of their thieving habits and were suspected of turning a profit on the food and clothing they received from sympathetic, charitable people. Note the emphasis on the threat posed by the so-called pirates, and on the notion that any charitable efforts to assist them would be profaned by the beneficiaries who would seek only to turn a profit. Perkins's goal seemed to be to discourage policies that might be motivated by sympathy for the French Canadians, and instead to encourage policies that would regulate their ability to procreate. Note that the dispositional traits ascribed to French Canadians did not always have an entirely negative valence. While sometimes described as lazy and unwilling to make an honest living, the French Canadians were often described as very industrious and easy to satisfy, that is, willing to work hard for very little pay. The following quotations capture those elements of the stereotype. These people have one good trait: they are indefatigable and docile. I never saw a more hardworking group of people. They are willing to work long for very little pay, and they are as thrifty as any Yankee. The French are just happy, easy-going. They are glad to earn enough for today and don't worry much about tomorrow. They never think about getting a better job. They take it for granted that they are going to do this kind of laboring work all the time. One can see how the dissonance-reducing role of this combination of stereotypes, which justified indifference to the inequalities and relative poverty of the French Canadians, and not assisting the French Canadians through public policies while still being able to pay them low wages for their long hours of hard work. Those inferior character traits were attributed to genetic interactions, as the French Canadians were said to have intermarried with Indians, precipitating a genetic and thus behavioral degradation. Let's return to one of the historical injustices that has been identified by future generations as worthy of reparations. These kinds of cases are particularly interesting because, much like a successful tort claim, they involve instances in which a wrong has been committed and acknowledged, and for which there has been an attempt at compensation or repair. But these examples are potentially illuminating because they usually involve sustained policies and institutions and beliefs that today seem clearly unjust to virtually everyone, but which at the time were seen by those in power as just, as the way things ought to be. In these cases, the difference between then and now, between just and unjust, has to do with the contrast in attributional accounts for the relevant actors. Who has a good disposition? Who has a threatening disposition? Who's moved by situation? And so on. In this video, we'll focus on the sort of beliefs and scientific theories behind forced sterilization policies in the 20th century. Note that over the course of the 20th century, around 65,000 individuals in 33 states were sterilized in the U.S. under state compulsory sterilization. As discussed in class, the success of California sterilization programs caught the attention of scientists and politicians in Nazi Germany, who used California's legislation as a model for their own sterilization codes. Before detailing some of the state policies on eugenics and forced sterilization, let me step back and quickly describe some of the larger trends in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that motivated and shaped those policies. During that time period, immense numbers of relatively poor, often profoundly impoverished and desperate people were pouring into urban areas from rural areas as workers on the farms were being displaced by various technologies, including tractors, and Jim Crow policies in the South were terrorizing blacks, sending them looking for security and jobs elsewhere, and as immigrants poured in from various parts of the world, creating ever more evident inequalities and the dissonance that goes along with it. This graph captures the annual immigration numbers between 1830 and 1950, making pretty evident the incredible influx in the late 19th and early 20th century of immigrants. One can also see the changing level of wealth inequality, here the percentage of total wealth held by the top 10%, peaking around the same time period. Although I won't take the time here to explain, I will simply point out that there are good reasons to believe that the two lines are causally linked. That is, the number of immigrants and the extent of inequality are related. A few words about the immigrants themselves. Most of the new arrivals were coming from desperate situations, conditions of extreme hunger, joblessness, religious or ethnic persecution, and so on, and arriving in desperate situations. In hope of a better future, they found themselves jobless, impoverished, hungry, homeless, alone, and vulnerable to predatory actors who were more or less waiting for them. There's no way to capture here the conditions, the filth, the stench, the squalor, and the fear in which many of these immigrants found themselves living. But it is possible to share a few photographs by Jacob Riis, snapped in and around Manhattan tenements at the end of the 19th century, and published in a book he titled How the Other Half Lives. Riis's goals was to make visible what some may have preferred to ignore. The conditions themselves, and efforts like his to expose those conditions, reflected and created considerable inequality dissonance on the part of many in the privileged half. And of course, as those conditions heightened inequality dissonance, the question was raised, what was the cause of these harsh conditions, stark inequalities, and human suffering? Because the group-based categorical distinctions were at the time especially salient, different races, ethnicities, languages, religious faiths, levels of education, traditions, skills. The question raised was really a question about group-based inequalities. In hindsight, there's really no disagreement that the group-based inequalities were entirely the consequence of situation. Yet at the time, the strong conventional view, particularly among the relatively well-off, was to see the group's collective situation, its disadvantage, as a reflection of collective disposition, that is, to see stick in missed situation. There were a variety of theories justifying such group-based judgments, and those became very popular throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Herbert Spencer, an English philosopher who applied Darwin's evolutionary theories to the concept of social relationships, what we now know as social Darwinism, was one of the most influential and best-selling authors of his generation. But by 1869, not long after the U.S. Civil War, the basic ideas of eugenics were beginning to take shape and take root. That year, Sir Francis Galton wrote a text called Hereditary Genius, which promoted an early version of eugenics. He outlined, for instance, the ideal measurements that were supposed to indicate a person's intelligence. Based on that analysis, he claimed to show that the face of African Americans, among other groups, had a certain slope that proved that they were of lower intelligence. Here you can see engrams for Herbert Spencer and Dalton's Hereditary Genius. Notice the way Dalton's ideas seem to get a second wave of recognition in the very early 20th century, around the time that immigration levels are reaching their peaks and around the time when the Plouffe family attempted to tie up to Henry Putnam's dock. Here again, these superimposed engrams vaguely suggest eugenics, and some of the ideas central to eugenics are gaining currency around that same time, that is, of Plouffe v. Putnam. With that as backdrop, let's look more closely at how the so-called science of eugenics helped to shape policies and to legitimate the dramatic and growing inequalities in the early 20th century. First, consider what the message of eugenics was to individuals. To those who qualified as fit, the message was simple: marry and mate and make many children with someone else who is similarly fit. To those who were unfit, the message was quite the opposite: don't get married and certainly don't have children. The American Eugenics Society promoted such ideas of racial betterment and genetic education through public lectures, conferences, publications, and exhibits at county and state fairs. At this exhibit from the Kansas Free Fair in 1929, you can get a sense of how the American Eugenics Society promoted these kinds of ideas to the public. On the display toward the left, you see a board full of guinea pigs. This board illustrates the way that genetic traits are passed from one generation to the next. Other posters highlighted the importance of taking as much care in promoting the pedigree of children as people often do in promoting the pedigree of their livestock. The audience of these sorts of displays are those who are already fit. They're the ones who should protect and promote the ancestry of their children. Again, the implied message to the so-called unfit was to have no children at all. This chart highlights the power of genetic disposition and the irrelevance of situation in explaining people's behavior or condition. The left side argues that all unfit human traits, from alcoholism to criminality and from pauperism to epilepsy, were the result of genetics and could be eliminated with just 3 generations of eugenic breeding. The right side of the poster, labeled the Triangle of Life, explains that self-help is really about eugenic breeding. Your identity is far more caught up in your genes, your heritage, than in anything else. What you really are, according to this poster, was determined when your parents were born. Lest you had any doubt about what genetic fitness looks like, here are a few photos that might clarify. Again, the message to the well-off white families, that is the so-called fit, was to pursue eugenic marriage and mate selection. As this poster explains, children get their basic qualities by inheritance. If they are to be strong, keen, efficient, and great, there must be good blood back of them. If you want your children to be well born, choose your husband because of fine qualities in his family as well as in himself. Then add the best training. These make a square deal for the children. Many leaders of the eugenics movement, including Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics, advocated issuing eugenic certificates. To obtain a certificate, individuals would need to be examined by a doctor and declared eugenically fit to marry. Although these did not become widespread, some were issued by the government. While eugenics may have led individuals to think about personal life decisions, making personal policies in that way, the real significance of eugenics was with respect to public policies, immigration laws, sterilization policies and reproductive rights, criminal laws, local government laws, and the so-called tax and transfer system. Generally, as we will see, the message of eugenics was that it was harmful and even immoral to assist the unfit, and it was desirable and moral to allow them to suffer, even to vanish under the pressures of nature's harsh hand. Many of those themes can be found in Albert Wigom's 1922 New Decalogue of Science, which argued that the social classes are ordained by nature. It's not the slums, he wrote, which make the slum people, but slum people who make the slums. It's not the church which makes people good, but good people who make the church. Godly people are largely born and not made. Notice the thrust of Wigom's argument. It's that disposition creates situation, and not the other way around. Most presidents and presidential candidates in the early 20th century were major supporters of eugenics-based policies. For instance, in 1911, Woodrow Wilson signed New Jersey's sterilization bill, which was an act to authorize and provide for the sterilization of feeble-minded, including idiots, imbeciles, and morons, epileptics, rapists, certain criminals, and other defectives. In 1913, Teddy Roosevelt wrote, "Someday we will realize that the prime duty, the inescapable duty of the good citizen of the right type is to leave his or her blood behind him in the world, and that we have no business to permit the perpetuation of citizens of the wrong type." And in 1921, Calvin Coolidge similarly argued that it is a self-evident truth that in a healthy community there's no place for the vicious, the weak of body, the shiftless, or the improvident. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully. With other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. Eugenics could be so widely embraced by politicians, in part because the science of eugenics itself had an impeccable intellectual heritage, promoted as it was by the most influential scholars at the most elite universities. Consider first Stanford University, founded in 1891. Stanford's first president was David Starr Jordan, and he served in that role for more than 20 years. Those of you who attended Stanford may recall the building named after him, Jordan Hall. Those of you who did not attend Stanford may actually know about Jordan Hall because it's the location of the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment. You may have heard about David Starr Jordan because of the prize that's named after him. Anyway, the bulk of Jordan's scholarly and political energy, especially toward the end of his career, was devoted to promoting eugenics and eugenics-inspired policies. He argued that poverty, dirt, and crime are the products of those in general who are not good material. It's not the strength of the strong, but the weakness of the weak which engenders exploitation and tyranny. The so-called charitable people who give to begging children and women with baskets have, he said, a vast sin to answer for. It is from them that this pauper element gets its consent to exist. So-called charity joins public relief in producing stillborn children, raising prostitutes, and educating criminals. As we've seen before, the message of this science is that those who try to help actually hurt. Those who feel compassion and have the urge to assist those who are disadvantaged are themselves part of the problem. They are the ones who are making it possible for the individuals that nature would eliminate to survive. The argument is not that those charitable people have bad intentions, but that the unintended consequences of their good intentions are the problem. Put differently, concerns about distribution should play no role in policy making. Okay, let's move to the East Coast and consider the role of Harvard University and its most prominent scholars in promoting eugenics. According to author Adam Cohen, Harvard administrators, faculty members, and alumni were at the forefront of American eugenics, founding eugenics organizations, writing academic and popular eugenics articles, and lobbying government to enact eugenics laws. And for many years, scarcely any significant Harvard voices, if any at all, were raised against it. Returning to the mid-19th century, we'll see that Edward Everett was then president of Harvard University, and he appointed Louis Agassiz, calling him the foremost scientist of the 19th century. And indeed he was. If you Google Louis Agassiz, you will be flooded with information and images of the Swiss-born biologist and geologist and his many writings. And you've probably heard of him, in part because of his scientific renown, and the fact that, like David Starr Jordan, he has a medal named after him. But if you spend any time in Cambridge now, you've come to see his name all over town. No matter what direction you walk from Harvard Law School, you're likely to run into his name. The Agassiz House is just beyond the Science Center. The Agassiz Baldwin Community Center is just a few blocks up Mass Ave. The closest elementary school, formerly known as the Agassiz Elementary School, it recently had its name changed to the Baldwin School, is just a short stroll up Oxford Street toward Porter Square. Roughly a mile from the law school, you can find the Agassiz Preschool. Indeed, Harvard Law School is located in the section of Cambridge officially known as Agassiz. Now, although Agassiz is well known and left a lasting imprint on our real estate, his intellectual legacy is quite tarnished. Agassiz grappled with and rejected key elements of Darwin's theory and advanced what he called polygenism, which posits that different groups identified as races were actually created separately and had unequal attributes. In his work, Agassiz became preoccupied with producing elaborate classification schemes and genealogies providing scientific confirmation for the superiority of white northern European stocks over the peoples of southern and eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. Agassiz was opposed to slavery and argued that his ideas were not at all political, just scientific. Nonetheless, Agassiz confided to friends that he felt physically ill in the presence of black people, and in many ways his work revealed a revulsion for non-whites. He wrote, for example, "The production of half-breeds is as much a sin against nature as incest in a civilized community is a sin against purity of character. No effort should be spared to check that which is abhorrent to our better nature and to the progress of a higher civilization and a pure morality." So we see in Agassiz's purportedly non-political scientific reasoning an argument against equality. He writes, "We ought to beware how we give the blacks rights by virtue of which they may endanger the progress of whites. Social equality I deem at all times impracticable. It's a natural impossibility, flowing from the very character of the Negro race. They are incapable of living on a footing of social equality with whites in one and the same community without becoming an element of social disorder." So not because Agassiz necessarily prefers things that way, but because social equality is simply an impossibility. There is, by his estimation, no way to get there. We are but balls with respect to racial or social equality, and any effort to try to achieve that end will only lead to social disorder. One of Agassiz's numerous ugly benefactions is the collection of photos that he commissioned in 1850, when as a Harvard professor he hired a South Carolina photographer to capture a series of images of slaves standing unclothed, shot from several angles. His goal was to use the photos to assist in his effort to prove the inferiority of blacks as a separate race. The images, familiar to many today, are haunting reminders of that dehumanizing mindset when black bodies were routinely the subject of white science as well as white violence. By far the most significant president of Harvard University in its history is Charles Eliot. Eliot was president for a record-setting 40 years, from 1869 to 1909. His presidency played out on an epic scale. Eliot is credited not only with transforming Harvard into a globally recognized modern research university, but also with remaking Harvard Law School and reinventing legal education. It was President Eliot who brought in Christopher Columbus Langdell to remake HLS. It was during Eliot's tenure that the construction of several new buildings, including Austin Hall in 1882 and Langdell in 1905, took place. If you find yourself curious about why photographs and artistic renderings of President Eliot highlight the left side of his face and obscure the right side of his face, it's because he had a vascular birthmark, sometimes called a port wine stain, on the right side of his face that he self-consciously attempted to conceal. In this 1911 photo, which was not posed, you might detect the discoloration, or as some described it, the deep crimson hue of his right cheek. But I show this picture for an additional reason. Marching alongside President Eliot is economics professor Frank W. Taussig, who I mention now because I'll be coming back to him in a few minutes. Notwithstanding President Eliot's salient physical imperfection, he was himself remarkably intolerant of those who deviated from the norm. Much like David Starr Jordan and much like the academic elites in cognoscenti around the country at that time, President Eliot was a strong supporter of the science of eugenics. In fact, Eliot was an outspoken proponent of forced sterilization of people declared to be feeble-minded, physically disabled, criminalistic, or otherwise flawed. In an address to the San Francisco Harvard Club, he discussed what he called racial purity and argued that each nation should keep its stock pure and that there should be no blending of races. In 1907, Indiana enacted the nation's first eugenic sterilization law. 4 years later, in a paper titled The Suppression of Moral Defectives, Charles Eliot declared that Indiana's law blazed the trail which all free states must follow if they would protect themselves from moral degeneracy and from the physical evils and losses which result from criminality. For what it's worth, engrams for Charles Eliot, Louis Agassiz, and Harvard Law School indicate a striking coincidence of references to each of them, at least during the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Charles Eliot's successor was A. Lawrence Lowell. Lowell served as president of Harvard University from 1909 to 1933, and he too was an active proponent of eugenics. As president of Harvard, Lowell worked to impose a quota on Jewish students and to prevent black students from living in the yard. Regarding national policy, he called for sharp limits to immigration, writing that the need for homogeneity in a democracy justifies policies resisting the influx of great numbers of a greatly different race. One of the scholars that President Lowell collaborated with was Charles Davenport, who was probably the most influential eugenics scholar in the U.S. Davenport attended Harvard University, earning a Ph.D. in biology in 1892, when Charles Eliot was president of the university and Christopher Columbus Langdell was dean of the law school. Davenport would later become a professor of zoology at Harvard and one of the most prominent American biologists of his time. Regarding his beliefs, Davenport wrote, "I believe that I am the trustee of the germplasm that I carry, that this has been passed on to me through thousands of generations before me, and that I betray the trust if that germplasm being good, I so act to jeopardize it with its excellent possibilities, or from motives of personal convenience to unduly limit offspring." In other words, Davenport felt he had a responsibility to previous and future generations to pass along his genetic gifts both carefully and generously. Regarding immigration policy, Davenport believed that there should be severe restrictions on who was and was not allowed into the country. Davenport also called for policies that would discourage the biological success of those groups that transported and traded in deficient germplasm. Weaknesses in society were, he argued, due to the natural preservation by the use of modern medicine of the feeble-minded and unfit. It is the intervention of man's non-natural assistance of the poor and weak that was causing the problem by interfering with nature's wise, albeit unforgiving, process. Such subgroups in the population and the policies that supported those groups posed a threat, he argued, to our security, to our health, to our well-being, and to our future as a species. He wrote, "The population of the United States will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more mercurial, more attached to music and art, and more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality, and that the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase." There are countless examples of prominent Harvard University professors supporting eugenics and eugenics-based policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We just don't have time to review them all, but I want to end this section by giving a couple more very quick examples. Botanist Edward East, in his 1919 book, Inbreeding and Outbreeding, argued that races have arisen which are as distinct in mental capacity as in physical traits. In his 1923 book, Mankind at the Crossroads, he warned that the nation was being flooded by the feeble-minded and that eugenics was therefore sorely needed. Indeed, social progress without it is unthinkable. William McDougall was the chair of Harvard's psychology department in 1921 when he called for a caste system based upon biological capacity, with legal restrictions upon breeding by the lower castes and upon intermarriage between the castes. Professor Ernest Houghton, a leader in a field known as physical anthropology, spent much of his career teaching at Harvard University. To give you a sense of his views, here's a quotation from a New York Times article that quoted him. "I think that a biological purge is the essential prerequisite for a social and spiritual salvation." Houghton would later call for a sit-down reproductive strike of the busy breeders among the morons, criminals, and social ineffectuals of our population. Zoologist William Castle, in his book Genetics and Eugenics, wrote that from the viewpoint of a superior race, there is nothing to be gained by crossing with an inferior race. And from the viewpoint of the inferior race, also the cross is undesirable if the two races live side by side, because each race will despise individuals of mixed race, and this will lead to endless friction. In other words, he seems to be saying, there is no reason or way to create equality or to live equally together. Professor Dudley Allen Sargent, who was brought in as a scholar and director of Hemingway Gymnasium for more than 40 years, infused physical education with eugenic principles, including his conviction that certain kinds of exercise were particularly important for female students. He explained that, in giving birth to a child, no amount of mental and moral education will ever take the place of a large, well-developed pelvis with plenty of muscular and organic power behind it. The presence of large female pelvises, he insisted, would determine whether large, brainy children shall be born at all. In the 1914 Race Betterment Conference in Michigan, Sargent told the conference that based on his long experience and careful observation of Harvard and Radcliffe students, physical education is one of the most important factors in the betterment of the race. Finally, let me get back to Frank Taussig. Professor Taussig was an American economist who taught at Harvard, and his articles and books on tariffs became the foundation of how modern trade theory is taught today. He was editor of the prominent Quarterly Journal of Economics. Taussig wrote that certain types of criminals and paupers breed only their kind, and society has a right and a duty to protect its members from the repeated burden of maintaining and guarding such parasites. The human race, he argued, could be immensely improved in quality and its capacity for happy living immensely increased if those of poor physical and mental endowment were prevented from multiplying. Taussig went further. The feeble-minded, he said, should simply be stamped out. We have not reached the stage where we can proceed to chloroform them once and for all, but at least they can be segregated, shut up in refuges and asylums, and prevented from propagating their kind. Now, I emphasize Taussig not simply because of how closely his suggestions align with the policies that were ultimately adopted during the Holocaust, but also to emphasize just how close to home all of these ideas are. Harvard University and Harvard Law School became what they are now under the scientific and administrative leadership of scholars who promoted these ideas. We are still bathing in their influence, often unknowingly. My senior thesis in college was one of 3 national finalists for the Frank W. Taussig Award. I remember well my sense of disappointment when the paper was not selected as the winner, which would have been a cash prize and publication of my paper in a peer-reviewed journal. It was for some years a source of regret. Having now researched the intellectual history of eugenics, I can now say, albeit at the risk of humble bragging and sour graping, that I am today quite happy and relieved not to have won the Frank W. Taussig Award. Still, I cannot pretend to have clean hands or deny the many benefits I have received and the contributions that I have made to an institution that has thrived economically and culturally by educating and training each generation of global elites, a success that at least in part reflects the role it has played in developing, promulgating and defending authoritative scientific theories that serve to legitimate social hierarchies and inequalities of all types. The last several years have witnessed numerous books and resources peeling back some of that history that seems somehow to have been forgotten. Even as that history comes into focus, and as we now memorialize that moment of recognition of history's forgotten, it seems we risk re-forgetting that history and of never truly coming to terms with the more important possibility that this university and law school did not only receive wealth from slavery as part of some sort of unintended byproduct of a serendipitous probate procedure 2 centuries ago, but may have helped make possible the institution of slavery and many other oppressive hierarchical institutions, laws, ideas, and structures, and have at every moment in its history both contributed to and drawn from the wealth of those institutions and structures. Be that as it may, according to Adam Cohen, an HLS graduate and author of the recent book Imbeciles, when it comes to the science of eugenics, Harvard University was, in part because of its overall prominence and influence on society, and in part because of its sheer enthusiasm, has been more central to American eugenics than any other university. As he explains, Harvard has, with some justification, been called the brain trust of 20th century eugenics. But the role it played is little remembered or remarked upon today. It is understandable that the university is not eager to recall its part in that tragically misguided intellectual movement, but it is a chapter too important to be forgotten. And it was in the time period in which eugenics thrived as a scientific theory, in which our most prominent, distinguished, and prized graduate and professor, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., was becoming a transformative legal scholar and jurist. It was his father, you may be interested to know, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., also closely connected with Harvard University, who coined the term Boston Brahmin, framing the wealth and status of elite Bostonians in terms of caste and bloodlines. Holmes Sr. was in fact one of the first American intellectuals to espouse eugenics, and he wrote about it in an 1861 book in which he distinguished his caste superiority in terms of its noble physiognomy and aptitude for learning, which he insisted were congenital and hereditary. In 1875, Holmes Sr. began an article he published in the Atlantic Monthly asking how it is that people can engage in crimes of wanton cruelty and the mystery that such behavior creates regarding how to explain the underlying behavior. In that same opening paragraph, he answers the question in part with his thesis that such individuals must have a moral nature very unlike that of ordinary human beings. To explain the source of the difference in moral nature, Holmes Sr. would refer to the contemporaneous research of one Dr. Harris, who investigated the source of crime trends in a particular region of New York State. Harris, according to Holmes, looked up the genealogy of the families whose names were oftenest on the criminal records. He found that a young girl called Margaret was left adrift a great many years ago in a village of the county. 6 generations later, she had 900 descendants, 200 of which were recorded as criminals, and a large number of the others idiots, imbeciles, drunkards, and of otherwise degraded character. The lesson, according to Holmes Sr., was that bad genetic seeds grow into bad trees that yield bad fruit. The insight, he suggests, is commonsensical and plain to see. After all, who that has seen 2 or 3 generations has not observed 1,000 transmitted traits, villainous or other, in those all around him? Why should not deep-rooted moral defects and obliquities show themselves, as well as other qualities, in the descendants of moral monsters? And just as deep dimpled chins pass from one generation to the next, doesn't it make sense that certain character traits will also be hereditary, such as the fatal instinct to pursue evil? That is the context in which Oliver Wendell Holmes would pen his opinion in Buck v. Bell, in which he would lament the intergenerational impact of lesser humans, and thus in the expectation of preventing the sort of atrocities and cruelties that his father had puzzled over, engaged in his own intergenerational sin, turning his father's ideas into policies of violence, all in the name of progress and morality. You might wonder if Justice Holmes ever regretted his decision in Buck v. Bell. If so, there's no evidence of it. Indeed, a few days after writing the opinion in Buck v. Bell, Justice Holmes described his own satisfaction with the opinion in a letter he wrote to a friend. I wrote and delivered a decision upholding the constitutionality of a state law for sterilizing imbeciles the other day, and felt I was getting near the first principle of reform. I have no respect for the passion for equality, which seems to me merely idealizing envy. A few months later, he followed that up with another note to his friend explaining, "Cranks, as usual, do not fail. One letter yesterday told me that I was a monster and might expect the judgment of God for a decision that a law allowing the sterilization of imbeciles was constitutional." And looking back, Holmes would boast in yet another letter to a friend that of all the opinions he wrote, Buck v. Bell was perhaps his proudest, his highlight. As he put it, "One decision that I wrote gave me pleasure, establishing the constitutionality of a law permitting the sterilization of imbeciles." This flipped classroom video briefly looked at Plouffe v. Putnam and the role that eugenics played in explaining and justifying inequalities around Lake Champlain in northern Vermont at the time. It then connected eugenics as a scientific theory to the then growing and increasingly salient inequalities in many parts of the U.S. And finally, it considered the role that prominent scientists developing scientific theories at elite universities like Stanford and Harvard played in promoting the policies of eugenics.